The Council had ordered humans banished from the galaxy, but dangerous mercenary Johnny Tucker would never obey. Earth had been declared permanently off-limits, and he'd kill anyone who dared challenge that. He hunched over a drink in the seedy bar at the fringe of Zarthos Station, face etched with the scars of brutal past fights. The bitter neon liquor burned his throat. Suddenly, a massive fist slammed the bar beside him. Johnny looked up to see an armored Rakari looming over him, fangs bared in a snarl. "Human trash, you are forbidden here. By order of the Rakari Council, your kind is banished on pain of death. Leave this station immediately." Johnny just narrowed his eyes, a cold glint in them. He turned slowly to face the Rakari. "Council's orders mean nothing, Scaled Face. Why don't you run back and tell them Earth's off-limits for good? Or are you man enough to try and make me leave?" Talon roared and swung a meaty fist, but Johnny ducked the blow and drove his own fist hard into the Rakari's stomach. Talon wheezed, doubling over. Johnny grabbed his collar and yanked him close. "You have two choices. Crawl back to your masters with your tail between your legs, or I put you in the ground. Earth is off-limits to you bastards for good." He shoved Talon back. The Rakari stumbled away, pure hate in his eyes, opening his maw to retort. Suddenly, a flash of blinding plasma exploded through his chest, leaving a cauterized hole. Talon twitched and collapsed dead to the floor. Johnny spun and drew his own weapon, as a dozen armored Rakari troops surged into the bar, blasters aimed. Patrons screamed in terror, scrambling for cover. A plasma bolt shrieked towards Johnny's face. He flung himself aside just in time, the superheated bolt grazing his neck, flash-searing his skin. He hit the ground rolling, came up in a crouch and started firing, picking off two soldiers with precise shots. The rest scattered for cover, returning fire. Johnny threw himself behind the bar as bolts blasted chunks out of the walls. He checked his weapon's charge, enough for one more fight. Johnny knew this was it. He would show these alien bastards what defiance really meant, and prove that Earth and humanity would never again be enslaved, even if it cost his life. Johnny twisted his head away, feeling the searing plasma bolt crackle past his ear, flash-burning his skin. He hit the ground and rolled, frantically scrambling behind the bar as a storm of plasma blasted it to flaming chunks. Shattered glass and noxious alien liquor rained down on him. He army-crawled through the liquid mess, trying to get some space from the Rakari troopers ripping the bar apart. Heart slamming against his ribs, Johnny spotted the door to the back room and launched into a desperate combat roll. Plasma bolts screamed around him, peppering his back with near misses as he smashed shoulder first through the door. It was a dimly lit storage room, crates of booze and bar supplies stacked high. His eyes landed on a utility grate in the wall near the floor. He fired a single shot, blowing the lock off in a shower of sparks. Johnny dove through the opening and into the tunnel beyond, just as the Rakari kicked down the door, plasma rifles blazing. He torched the grate shut behind him with his pistol's built-in ion welder, sealing himself in. The maintenance shaft was a tight, claustrophobic squeeze. He could hear the kill team ripping the storeroom apart, searching for him. Muffled plasma blasts echoed behind the sealed hatch. He low-crawled at a frantic pace, his broad shoulders scraping the metal walls, trying to get far away fast. His wrist computer lit up, the schematic for Zarthos Station he'd stolen earlier. The tunnel snaked through the guts of the station, twisting and turning for over a kilometer. It terminated at an old hangar bay used by small-time smugglers and their ships. If he could reach it, he might be able to bribe or blast his way onto a ship and escape. A big might. Odds were high the Rakari would have troops waiting. He checked his pistol's ammo readout. Only a handful of shots left before it clicked empty. Jaw set, he pushed forward, crawling on his elbows, dragging himself through the bowels of Zarthos, one arduous pull at a time. The sounds of Rakari soldiers gutting the bar faded behind him, replaced by the thump of his own heartbeat in his ears and the metallic scraping of his armor on the cold steel. The access hatch creaked open, the rusted hinges protesting against Johnny's exhausted push. He peered through the narrow gap, eyes scanning the abandoned hangar bay splayed before him. Flickering overhead lights cast an eerie glow across the cavernous space, illuminating piles of scrap metal, decrepit cargo containers, and a scattering of dilapidated smuggler ships in varying states of disrepair. Johnny eased himself out of the tunnel, plasma pistol clutched tight in his hand. He ducked behind a large metal shipping crate, using it as cover while he surveyed his surroundings more thoroughly. A handful of shady-looking aliens milled about near their ships, but there was no sign of any Rakari soldiers yet. He weighed his options, trying to decide which of these unsavory smugglers looked most likely to accept a bribe in exchange for passage off this god-forsaken station. But before he could make his move, the hangar bay's main doors exploded inward with an ear-splitting boom. Shrapnel from the twisted metal doors flew in every direction. Johnny barely managed to duck back behind the crate in time as a dozen heavily armed Rakari soldiers stormed into the hangar, plasma rifles spewing deadly bolts of energy. The smugglers scrambled for cover, some brave or foolish enough to return fire with their own weapons, while others made a desperate run for their ships. Amidst the chaos of plasma bolts crisscrossing the hangar and tearing into metal and flesh alike, Johnny spied an opportunity. A small, fast-looking ship at the far end of the hangar, its boarding ramp already lowered, beckoning him. He made a split-second decision and broke from his cover, sprinting full tilt across the hangar floor. Johnny was mere steps from the boarding ramp when white-hot agony exploded in his left shoulder, sending him stumbling. A plasma bolt had found its mark, burning through his armor and into his flesh. Gritting his teeth against the searing pain, Johnny hurled himself up the ramp with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. He slammed his fist on the close button, and the ramp began to grind shut with agonizing slowness. Johnny staggered into the cockpit and collapsed into the pilot's seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. With his one good arm, he began frantically flipping switches and turning dials, coaxing the ship's engines to life. The engines roared, just as the Rakari soldiers reached the ship, pounding on the hull trying to pry open the ramp. Johnny let out a defiant yell and slammed the throttle full forward. The ship blasted out of the hangar, the sudden acceleration sending the Rakari soldiers tumbling head over heels like discarded toys. As the ship rocketed away from Zarthos Station and out into the cold, star-speckled void of space, Johnny slumped back in the pilot's seat. Pain and blood loss made his vision swim dangerously. He knew he needed to tend to his wounded shoulder, but he also knew with grim certainty that the Rakari wouldn't let him go so easily. They'd have ships in pursuit any minute now. He had to put distance between himself and Zarthos Station, and fast. With a shaking, blood-slick hand, Johnny engaged the autopilot, letting the computer charts the fastest course away from here. As the adrenaline began to fade, and the full weight of his situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket, a bleak realization crystallized in Johnny's mind. There was only one place left in the whole damned galaxy where he might be safe, where even the Rakari couldn't reach him. And it was the one place he had sworn he would never set foot again. With a bitter curse, Johnny set course for the only safe haven he had left, the one place he thought he had escaped for good all those years ago, Earth. The ship shuddered and groaned around him as it streaked through the void, straining to hold itself together. Johnny staggered down the narrow corridor, shoulder burning with each lurching step, leaving a trail of crimson droplets floating behind him in the zero-G. He gripped the bulkhead, fighting to stay upright as his head swam. Fingers shaking, he fumbled it open, grabbing a syringe of painkillers. He jammed the needle into his thigh, gasping at the sting. Next, a coagulant patch, slapped haphazardly over the weeping plasma burn. The drugs hit his system like a hammer, dulling the edges of his agony. Steadying himself against the exam table, Johnny snatched up a laser scalpel and dermal regenerator. Jaw clenched tight, he carefully sliced away the blackened, blistered flesh around the wound, the stench of burnt meat thick in the air. The regenerator hummed as he ran it over the raw weeping mess of his shoulder, knitting the savaged flesh back together, cell by painful cell. Spent, Johnny half-walked, half-fell back to the cockpit, collapsing into the pilot's chair. His head throbbed in time with his thundering pulse as he called up the nav computer. Earth's coordinates glowed on the screen, taunting him. He'd sworn he'd die before ever setting foot on that poisoned rock again. But the Rakari had changed the game. If even the fringes weren't safe anymore, he swallowed bile. Earth was his only play. But why? The question pounded in his skull as he laid in the course with an unsteady hand. Why hit Zarthos Station? Why come for him? What was their angle? The proximity alarm shrieked, jolting him like an electric shock. His eyes locked on the sensor readout, and his blood turned to ice in his veins. A Rakari warship, a god's damned dreadnought, was bearing down on him, cannons hot. Johnny wrenched the ship into a desperate corkscrew, the hull shuddering as the shields drank a volley of plasma. Warning lights flashed crimson, alarms howled. He jinked and juked, dancing a manic evasive pattern, but it was futile. The dreadnought outclassed his stolen scrap heap in every way. A thunderous impact. The ship tumbled end over end, a dying thing. Smoke belched from ruptured conduits. The lights flickered and died as the engines fell silent. The dreadnought filled the forward screen, blotting out the stars. A voice like grinding stones crackled over the comm. "Human vessel, this is Commander Zektar of the Rakari Empire. You are harboring a fugitive wanted for crimes against the Empire. Surrender now, or be destroyed." Johnny hauled himself upright, mind whirling. He was well and truly caught. Outrunning them was laughable, fighting, suicide. But maybe, just maybe. A wild laugh burbled up from his chest as he slapped the comm button. "Commander Zektar, this is Johnny Tucker. I've got a counteroffer for you." He bared his teeth in a feral grin. "How about you kiss my human ass?" And he brought his fist down on the self-destruct, hard enough to break bones. Bracing himself against the bulkhead, Johnny hammered his fist into the flashing self-destruct button. Alarms blared as the ship's computer began the final countdown. Self-destruct sequence initiated. 10 seconds until detonation. Adrenaline surging, Johnny launched himself down the corridor towards the escape pods, sparks raining down from ruptured conduits. His boots pounded the deck, his heart slamming against his ribs. He hit the escape pod running, diving through the hatch. His fist slammed the eject button. The pod blasted free with a bone-rattling jolt, shooting into the void. A second later, the ship exploded in a blinding flash. The shockwave slammed into the pod, sending it tumbling end over end. Johnny clung to the crash webbing, his skull rattling as the inertial dampeners strained to compensate. Through the spinning viewport, he caught a glimpse of the Rakari warship, shields flickering but intact. Its plasma cannons swiveled to track the pod, glowing with deadly charge. Johnny's heart seized. This was it. He'd escaped the ship, but he was a sitting duck out here. The warship would vaporize him with a single shot. Suddenly, missiles streaked past the viewport and slammed into the warship's shields, exploding in dazzling fireballs. The ship reeled back, its cannons going wide. A squadron of sleek fighters flashed past, human markings bold on their wings. They swarmed the warship like wasps attacking a bear, strafing it with laser fire and missiles. The ship fired back, plasma bolts crisscrossing the void, but the fighters dodged and wheeled, always a hair's breadth ahead. Johnny gaped, scarcely believing his eyes. The EDF, they had actually come. For him, but how? Why? The pod shuddered, bathed in shimmering blue light. Johnny's skin tingled as a tractor beam locked on, dragging the pod towards a massive shape emerging from hyperspace, the angular, predatory bulk of an EDF carrier, one of the most powerful ships in the human fleet. The pod thunked down in the carrier's cavernous hangar, settling amongst the orderly chaos of flight crews scrambling to service the fighters. Medics stood by with gurneys and kits ready for casualties. The hatch popped with a hiss and Johnny staggered out, his shoulder a blaze of pain. Armed Marines surrounded him instantly, rifles aimed and ready. He raised his hands in weary surrender. A grizzled, scar-faced officer shouldered through the cordon, his eyes hard as he took in Johnny's ragged state. Johnny blinked in disbelief. "Captain Harkin, what the hell are you doing here?" Harkin's face twisted into a scowl. "Saving your sorry hide, apparently. Though I'm damned if I know why after that stunt you pulled on Sigma 9. He jerked his chin towards the hangar entrance, where the space battle raged on. The Rakari crossed a line when they attacked you in neutral space. They violated the Earth Defense Treaty, and now they're gonna pay for it. Harkin spun to his Marines, his bellow filling the hangar. All hands, battle stations, we're going in hot. The EDF carrier shook as energy blasts slammed against its shields. In the medbay, Johnny gritted his teeth as the ship pitched and rolled. A medic stumbled, almost jabbing Johnny with a laser scalpel. Sorry, the medic mumbled, regaining his balance. This is my first combat mission. The medbay doors hissed open, and Captain Harkin strode in, his face grim. He pulled up a chair next to Johnny's bed. Johnny eyed him warily. I'm not going anywhere, Captain. Say your piece. Harkin leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The Rakari have been pushing the boundaries of the Earth Defense Treaty for months, but attacking a human ship, that's new. Johnny nodded, then winced as the medic applied a dermal regenerator to his plasma-seared shoulder. They were waiting for me on Zarthos Station, like they were hunting me. That's not all. We intercepted Rakari comms. They keep mentioning Operation Downfall. Harkin's voice was grave. We don't know what it is yet, but it's big, and involves Earth. Johnny's stomach clenched. Earth? But the treaty. Exactly. They're risking war with humanity. Whatever they're planning, it's worth that risk to them. Harkin fixed Johnny with a hard stare. Tucker, I know we've had our differences, but right now I need you. You've spent more time in Rakari space than any other human. I need you to be my eyes and ears out there. Johnny sat up straight, ignoring the hot stab of pain. You want me to spy on them? Harkin nodded. Infiltrate their ranks. Find out what Operation Downfall is and stop it before it's too late. He stood, jaw clenched. The Rakari have made their move, now it's our turn. As Harkin left, Johnny slumped back, mind whirling. Infiltrate the Rakari, a suicide mission. But if they were moving on Earth, he might be the only one who could stop them. All the years he'd spent running from his past, the things he'd done, maybe this was his chance to make things right. Groaning, Johnny swung his legs off the bed and stood, steadying himself. He'd need a plan, and fast. The fate of Earth hung in the balance. The medbay doors hissed open again. Johnny looked up, expecting Harkin, but it was a woman, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her uniform crisp and unadorned. Her eyes, a striking pale blue, locked onto Johnny's. Mr. Tucker, she said, her voice clipped and precise. I'm Commander Zara Novak, EDF Intelligence. Captain Harkin said you might be reluctant to assist us. Johnny snorted. Assist you? You mean be your sacrificial lamb? Novak arched an eyebrow. Melodramatic but not inaccurate. This mission will be dangerous, perhaps fatal, but it is also necessary. She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. You are uniquely suited for this task, Mr. Tucker. Your knowledge of the Rakari, your skills, your moral flexibility. We need someone like you. Johnny bristled. Moral flexibility, is that what you call it? I call it an asset, in this line of work. Novak's lips quirked just slightly. The Rakari are not playing by the rules. Neither can we. Not if we want to save Earth. But if the Rakari destroyed it? He met Novak's eyes again. What's the plan? Johnny frowned. And then what? I just ask around about their secret plan? No, you'll be infiltrating one of their military bases, as a technician. Novak handed him a data pad. Everything you need is here. Identity documents, passcodes, schematics. Johnny scrolled through the data, his eyebrows climbing. This is thorough. We've been preparing this for months, waiting for the right operative. Novak's gaze was assessing, almost predatory. You will get us the intelligence we need, Mr. Tucker, by any means necessary. Johnny's grip tightened on the data pad. By any means necessary. He knew what that meant, knew the things he might have to do, the lines he might have to cross. But if it meant saving Earth? He squared his shoulders, ignoring the twinge of pain. When do I leave? The days blurred together in a haze of intensive preparation. Johnny pored over every scrap of Rakari intelligence the EDF had gathered, committing their language, customs, and tactics to memory. He spent hours in the armory, working closely with the weapons specialist to craft the perfect loadout for his mission. His stealth suit was a marvel of human ingenuity, a sleek black second skin bristling with hidden blades, explosives, and hacking tools. Finally, the fateful day arrived. Johnny stood tall in the carrier's cavernous hangar bay, his suit's matte finish drinking in the stark light. A hand-picked team of EDF operatives flanked him, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. Captain Harkin strode up, his weathered face grave. He clasped Johnny's shoulder. "Remember, Tucker, this is a recon mission. Gather intel only. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. We need to know what Operation Downfall is before we can hope to stop it." Johnny met his gaze, his jaw set like iron. "Understood, sir. I'll uncover the Rakari's plans and I'll make damn sure they rue the day they set their sights on Earth." With a final nod, he turned and marched towards his waiting ship. The sleek stealth vessel seemed to melt into the hangar's shadows, its angular lines promising silent lethality. As the hatch sealed behind him with a pneumatic hiss, Johnny felt an eerie calm settle over him. He slid into the pilot's seat, his hands dancing over the controls with practiced ease. This was what he was made for. The ship knifed out of the hangar and into the star-speckled void, its advanced cloaking systems rendering it little more than a ghostly shimmer. Johnny angled the nose towards a massive Rakari battle station hanging in space like a bloated insect, its hull bristling with cannon turrets. As he drew closer, his suit and ship synced up, their surfaces rippling and shifting to mimic Rakari energy signatures. Slipping past the station's perimeter defenses, he glided into a secluded hangar bay, just another Rakari vessel among hundreds. Johnny emerged from his ship and melted into the bustling crowds of Rakari soldiers and technicians. He moved like a living shadow, his suit's camouflage bleeding into the alien architecture. He ghosted through the labyrinthine corridors, planting microscopic listening devices and worming his way into computer terminals. Fragments of intel trickled in, whispers of a colossal fleet massing in a hidden system, poised to strike at humanity's core. But as he burrowed deeper into the Rakari systems, a chill crept up Johnny's spine. Plans flickered across his visor, detailed schematics for a multi-pronged assault on Earth itself. Simultaneous invasions of major cities, all coordinated with cold, surgical precision. The Rakari had amassed a warfleet beyond anything the EDF had ever conceived, and the attack was mere days away. Earth was on the brink of annihilation. Johnny's heart pounded against his ribs as he downloaded the precious intel. He had to get this back to the EDF, had to warn them before it was too late. But as he slipped back towards his ship, the station's alarm shrieked to life. Crimson lights bathed the corridors in bloody hues. A cold knot formed in Johnny's gut. They knew, somehow they knew. Rakari soldiers poured into the hangar, plasma rifles primed and hungry. Johnny dove behind a fuel pylon, his suit's active camouflage shimmering wildly as it tried to compensate. His cover exploded in a geyser of flame and shrapnel, hurling him across the deck. Ears ringing, he rolled to his feet, pulse pistol leaping into his hand. He squeezed the trigger, the weapon bucking as it spat searing bolts of plasma. 2 Rakari went down, their chests smoking ruins, but more surged forward, a tide of armored scales and gnashing teeth. Johnny leapt and twisted, his suit's enhanced servos propelling him through the chaos. Plasma bolts sizzled past, close enough to scorch his armor. He returned fire on the move, dropping Rakari left and right. But there were too many. They just kept coming, an endless flood of hissing, snarling killers. Johnny's pistol clicked dry, its power cells spent. He hurled a concussion grenade and sprinted for his ship, the explosion blooming behind him like an angry sun. Plasma bolts stitched the deck at his heels. Johnny flung himself into the open hatch, his fist slamming the close button. The hatch ground shut, the ship's hull shuddering as the Rakari opened up with heavy weapons. He threw himself into the pilot's seat, hands flying over the controls. The engines roared to life, the inertial compensators whining in protest as he slammed the throttle to full. The stealth ship screamed out of the hangar, its hull sloughing globs of molten metal. Rakari fighters were already in pursuit, their plasma cannons gouging the void. Johnny juked and jinked, coaxing every last ounce of speed from his battered vessel. The stars blurred past, smearing into long lines of light. A fighter slid into his sights. Johnny triggered a burst from his ship's belly cannons and watched in grim satisfaction as the Rakari craft disintegrated into a cloud of flaming shrapnel. But more fighters were closing in, their cannons hammering his failing shields. Warning lights flashed crimson, claxons blaring in his ears. With a defiant roar, Johnny wrenched the ship into a wild corkscrew, plasma bolts filling the space where he'd been a heartbeat before. He punched the hyperdrive, the stars stretching into infinity as the ship leapt into the swirling maelstrom of hyperspace. But even as the Rakari fell away behind him, Johnny knew this was only the beginning. The true battle was still to come. Earth stood on the knife's edge of oblivion, and time was running out. Sirens shrieked as Rakari soldiers flooded the hangar bay, plasma rifles spitting deadly fire. Johnny burst into a sprint, his heart slamming against his ribs. Bolts of searing plasma zipped past him, near misses scorching his stealth suit. He juked left, then right, his enhanced reflexes barely keeping him ahead of the onslaught. His targeting reticle flashed red as he returned fire on the move, his wrist-mounted pulse cannons barking. Rakari soldiers jerked and fell, punctured by the lethal bolts. But more kept coming, a flood of armored scales and gnashing teeth. They poured into the hangar from every entrance, threat displays flaring crimson. Plasma fire stitched the walls and floor around Johnny, molten metal spattering. "Tucker, we see you." His EDF support team's voice crackled over his comm. "Hang tight, we're hitting 'em hard." The entire battle station suddenly heaved, titanic explosions booming through its superstructure. Massive secondary detonations chained through its hull as the EDF ships unloaded a devastating salvo into its defenses. The lights flickered wildly overhead, then died completely, plunging the hangar into stroboscopic emergency lighting. Rakari soldiers stumbled in the sudden darkness, their firing patterns going erratic. Johnny never slowed. His suit's autosenses cut through the gloom, painting his targets in ghostly thermal hues. He dropped 2 more with point-blank shots, then vaulted over a burning supply crate. There, his stealth ship squatted on the debris-strewn deck, its matte-black hull pockmarked by plasma hits. Pulse hammering in his ears, Johnny hit the remote startup. The ship's engines coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, blasting a cone of blistering backwash across the hangar. Rakari dove for cover from the searing exhaust. Johnny leapt for the lowering boarding ramp, a plasma bolt sizzling past his head close enough to crisp his hair. He rolled into the ship, slapped the ramp control, and vaulted into the pilot's seat in one fluid motion. The ship lurched as he wrenched the controls into a stomach-churning climb, inertial dampeners whining in protest. Plasma fire hammered the hull, splashing against the shields in blinding sprays of pyrotechnics. The hangar's maglocks disengaged with a shuddering boom, and the ship hurtled out into the void, trailing smoke and molten shards of metal. Johnny angled sharply away from the battle station, punching the engines to emergency power. For a heartbeat, he dared to hope they'd made a clean getaway. Then his sensor board screamed a warning and his blood turned to ice in his veins. A wall of Rakari warships hung in space before him, a blockade of bristling gun barrels and knife-edged hulls. Hundreds of them, a trap laid just for him. They'd known all along. Let him find the intel on Operation Downfall. Let him glimpse the enormity of what was coming, the sheer scale of the Rakari invasion force. They wanted Earth to know, wanted humanity gripped by fear and despair on the eve of its destruction. The Rakari ships opened fire as one, a cataclysmic barrage of plasma that lit the void like a newborn sun. Johnny wrenched the ship into a wild corkscrew, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Alarms howled as the shields strained, reeling under the onslaught. "I want me to run," Johnny roared into the comm, defiant in the face of certain death. "Come and get me, you scaly bastards!" And he plunged the stealth ship directly into the teeth of the Rakari fleet, a black dart arrowing into the eye of the storm. The void lit with 1,000 plasma trails as the fleet tracked his suicidal charge, pouring fire into his wake. Johnny juked and spiraled, his hands a blur on the controls. Space twisted and warped around him as he pushed the inertial dampeners past tolerance, the ship groaning and shuddering, near to flying apart. The EDF support ships dove into the fray, weapons blazing. They darted among the Rakari ships, afterburners flaring, drawing fire away from Johnny's desperate run. A Rakari cruiser broke in half, spewing fire, as an EDF frigate raked it with a sustained broadside. But the Rakari gave as good as they got. EDF ships vanished in blinding fireballs as plasma beams found their marks. The space between the fleets became a maelstrom of debris and expanding gas, a killing field of shattered metal and vaporized flesh. Johnny's ship bucked like a wounded animal as a plasma beam grazed its flank, alarms shrieking, shield indicators redlining. Gritting his teeth, Johnny held course, angling for a gap in the Rakari line. Just a little further. Suddenly, space itself seemed to tear open before him. A swirling maelstrom of light and shadow yawned wide, a wormhole ripping into existence. Johnny gaped in disbelief as an EDF fleet emerged from the impossible breach, ships pouring from its maw like silvery fish from some cosmic sea. It was a fleet to dwarf the one at his back, hundreds upon hundreds of ships, a city of metal and ceramic and thrumming power. And at its heart, Johnny's breath caught in his throat, a super-dreadnought, a mountain of armor and guns, a king of the void. It dwarfed the ships around it like a whale among minnows, its mile-long hull bristling with enough firepower to lay waste to a world. The Rakari fleet faltered, thrown into sudden disarray by this impossible apparition. Ships broke formation, some fleeing, some turning to fight. The super-dreadnought opened fire, a solar flare of light and fury, and Rakari ships simply vanished, atoms scattered to the stellar winds. In the chaos, Johnny saw his chance. He slammed the throttle wide open, the engine's scream rising to a triumphant howl. The stealth ship leapt forward like a greyhound loosed from its cage, the Rakari ships flashing past in blurred streaks of metal. He burst through their crumbling line, shields sparking and flaring, and arrowed towards the super-dreadnought at the heart of the EDF formation. As he closed with the massive ship, he stabbed a finger at his comm panel, transmitting the precious intel on Operation Downfall in a burst of compressed data. "Tucker," Captain Harkin's voice, rendered tinny by distance and radiation, crackled from the speakers. "Damn fine work out there, son. You got us the intel we needed, and just in the nick of time." Johnny could hear the grim smile in the old soldier's voice. "Now form up on us. We've got a little lesson to teach these Rakari bastards about what happens when they mess with Earth." With the full might of the EDF fleet at his back, Johnny roars into the heart of the battle, plasma cannons blazing. His stealth ship darts and weaves through the maelstrom of destruction, picking off Rakari ships with pinpoint precision. All around him, the EDF fleet unleashes hell on the Rakari forces. The super-dreadnought is a titan among ships, its massive guns tearing through Rakari hulls like tissue paper. Explosions blossom in the void as ship after ship is reduced to molten slag. Johnny whoops in savage joy as he sends another Rakari fighter spiraling into oblivion. The comm channels are alive with the triumphant roar of EDF pilots as they push the Rakari back, avenging every fallen comrade, every shattered world. But the Rakari are far from beaten. They fight back with the ferocity of cornered beasts, their plasma cannons stitching the void with deadly fire. EDF ships shudder and break apart under the onslaught, brave souls snuffed out in an instant. As the battle reaches a fever pitch, Johnny's senses lock onto a monstrous shape emerging from the Rakari lines. His blood runs cold. It's a dreadnought, a leviathan of a ship bristling with enough firepower to lay waste to a planet. He opens a comm channel to Captain Harkin. "Sir, I have eyes on the Rakari flagship. Permission to engage?" Harkin's voice crackles with static and determination. "Permission granted, Tucker. Take that bastard down." Johnny grins, a feral baring of teeth. "With pleasure, sir." He punches the throttle, rocketing towards the dreadnought. Plasma bolts fill the space around him, a deadly lattice of energy that would fry his ship in an instant. But Johnny flies like a man possessed, twisting and turning, always a hair's breadth from annihilation. As he nears the dreadnought, his eyes narrow. There, a small thermal exhaust port, barely 2 meters wide, a direct conduit to the ship's reactor core, an impossible shot. But Johnny Tucker laughs in the face of impossible. He wrenches the ship into a dizzying spin, lining up the shot. The dreadnought looms before him, filling his view screen, its hull pitted and scarred from the battle. Johnny's finger hovers over the trigger, his breath caught in his throat. The plasma torpedo leaps from his ship, a searing lance of blue-white light. It streaks across the void, straight and true. Johnny's heart hammers as it nears the exhaust port and disappears inside. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the dreadnought convulses, explosions ripping through its hull. Secondary detonations bloom along its length as its reactor goes critical. With a final titanic blast, the flagship is torn asunder from within, a billion pieces of flaming shrapnel pinwheeling into the void. Cheers erupt over the comm as the Rakari fleet, seeing their flagship destroyed, breaks and runs. EDF ships give chase, harrying the retreating Rakari, ensuring they won't be back anytime soon. In the sudden quiet of his cockpit, Johnny slumps back in his seat, his heart still racing. He knows this isn't the end. The Rakari will return, thirsting for revenge. Earth must be ready. Johnny smiles, a small tired thing. It's time to go home. Earth is calling. As the EDF super dreadnought entered Earth's orbit, Johnny felt a surge of pride and relief. They had done it. They had stopped the Rakari invasion and saved humanity from annihilation. But even as the ship docked and the celebrations began, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He stepped out onto the landing platform to a hero's welcome. Crowds cheered and waved flags, chanting his name. Dignitaries and politicians lined up to shake his hand and offer their congratulations. But through it all, Johnny's mind was elsewhere. In the days that followed, he met with the EDF leadership to debrief and discuss next steps. But what they told him sent a chill down his spine. The Rakari invasion, it turned out, was not an isolated incident. For years, the EDF had been fighting off similar threats from species across the galaxy, all of them seeing humanity as weak and ripe for conquest. "The Rakari were just the latest," Admiral Jameson said, his face grim. "And they won't be the last. We've been lucky so far, but our luck is running out. We need to take drastic action." The decision was made swiftly and unanimously. Earth would cut all ties with the galactic community, sealing itself off from the rest of the universe. No more trade, no more diplomacy, no more contact of any kind. Earth would become a fortress, a world unto itself. Johnny stood in the crowd as the announcement was made, watching the reactions of those around him. Some cheered, their faces alight with fierce nationalism. Others wept, mourning the loss of the dream of a united galaxy. And still others sat in stunned silence, unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. In the weeks that followed, Johnny threw himself into the work of fortifying Earth. He oversaw the construction of massive orbital defense platforms, bristling with weaponry. He trained new recruits in the art of space combat, drilling them until they were a well-oiled machine. And he worked with scientists and engineers to develop new technologies, designed to keep Earth safe from any and all threats. But even as he worked, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The EDF leadership seemed more secretive than ever, holding closed-door meetings and making decisions without consulting the rank and file. And strange reports started to surface of dissent and unrest among the population, whispers of people who opposed the isolation of Earth. At first, Johnny tried to ignore it. He was a soldier, not a politician. But as the reports grew more frequent and more troubling, he knew he couldn't sit idly by. He started to investigate, digging into the EDF's records and interviewing those who had been silenced. What he found shook him to his core. The EDF leadership had been infiltrated by a radical faction, one that saw the isolation of Earth not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent solution. They believed that humanity needed to evolve beyond the need for contact with other species, that the only way to ensure survival was to cut all ties forever. And they were willing to go to any lengths to make that happen. Dissent was crushed, dissenters disappeared. The media was controlled, feeding the population a steady diet of propaganda, and all the while, the radicals tightened their grip on power. It was a war fought not with ships and weapons, but with information and influence. Johnny and his team leaked documents, hacked databases, and spread the word to those who would listen. They faced opposition at every turn, from both the radicals and those who had bought into their lies. But in the end they were successful. The truth came out and the radicals were exposed. There were riots in the streets, protests demanding change. The EDF leadership was purged, the radicals arrested or driven into hiding. But the victory came at a cost. Many lives were lost, both in the fighting and in the chaos that followed. The EDF was left fractured and weakened, its reputation tarnished in the eyes of the people. And Earth's isolation held, at least for now. The defense platforms remained in orbit, the recruits continued their training. But it was a fragile peace, constantly under threat from both outside forces and internal strife. Johnny stood on the observation deck of the EDF headquarters, looking out over the sprawling city below. The scars of the recent battles were still visible, the ruins of buildings and the makeshift memorials to the fallen. But beyond that, he could see the signs of life continuing. People going about their daily lives, children playing in the streets. The human spirit, indomitable as ever, rising from the ashes. He knew that the fight was far from over. The Rakari and other threats still loomed large, and humanity's future was far from certain. But he also knew that as long as there were those willing to stand up and fight for what was right, there was always hope. Earth may be alone in the universe, but it was not defenseless, and Johnny Tucker would be there on the front lines, ready to face whatever challenges the future may bring. He turned away from the window, squaring his shoulders. There was work to be done. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.